everybody. Hope you had a good lunch. I'm Lyndon Estes. I'm an associate professor here in the Graduate School of Geography, and I have the honor of moderating our panel today with 4 distinguished panelists, which we're talking about Clarke Geography and Transformed Environments, Past, Present, and Future. This panel will be focusing on Clarke Geography's long history of influential research on human transformations of environments and responses to those transformations, ranging from the risk hazards tradition and the pivotal volume Earth Transformed to contemporary work on climate change dynamics, impacts, and responses. So I'm going to introduce each of our 4 speakers within the order in which they will be presenting. First, I would like to introduce Regents Professor Billie Lee Turner, who is the Gilbert F. White Professor of Environment and Society in the School of Geographic Sciences and Urban Planning at Arizona State University. Professor Turner was a member of the Graduate School of Geography for 28 years, from 1980 to 2008, and served as director of the school for different periods covering 10 years, and as founding director of the Marsh Institute for 3 years. A geographer and human environmental scientist, he pursues research across subjects ranging from prehistory to contemporary climate change and sustainability, which includes work on vulnerability and resilience, and deforestation primarily in Mexico and Central America, and urban design in arid environments, especially in the American Southwest. Professor Turner has been involved in a number of international and national science programs examining global environmental change, including those dealing with land systems, of the International Geosphere Biosphere Program, the International Human Dimensions Program, Diversitas, and the U.S. National Climate Assessment, and is a senior review editor for climate change and land and IPCC Special Report. He is a member of the National Academy of Sciences and an associate editor of the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences focused on sustainability. So our second panelist will be Professor Karen Frey, whose research interests involve the combined use of field measurements, satellite remote sensing, and geoscience to study large-scale linkages between land, atmosphere, ocean, and ice in polar environments. I should point out that Professor Frey is a professor in the Graduate School of Geography. Over the past 25 years, she has conducted field-based research in West and East Siberia, the North Slope of Alaska, as well as the Bering, Chukchi, and Beaufort Seas. Her most recent work focused on the biological and biogeochemical impacts of sea ice decline in polar shelf environments, as well as the hydrological and biogeochemical impacts of terrestrial permafrost degradation across the Arctic. She's been a faculty member for 16 years in the GSG and teaches and advises students in the fields of climate change, polar science, and remote sensing. Our third speaker will be Professor Chris Williams. He's a professor of Earth System Science within Clarke's School of Geography and directs Clarke's program in environmental science. He and his team engage in foundational research on the climate impacts of forests, combining Earth observation data sets with big data geocomputation. Their group is at the forefront of assessing carbon emissions and removals associated with deforestation and reforestation worldwide, and how changes in surface reflectivity affect the climate system. Their work is informing decision makers about where we get the greatest climate benefit from retaining and expanding tree cover worldwide, including the Nature Conservancy, the Open Space Institute, the Trust for Public Lands, and states in the U.S. Climate Alliance. Among other services, the discipline, he has co-chaired the Science Leadership Group of the North American Carbon Program and served as science team member of NASA's Carbon Monitoring System. And our fourth speaker will be Dr. Susanne Moser, who's an independent scholar and a consultant who works in the U.S. and internationally from a base in western Massachusetts, the unceded ancestral homeland of the Nipmuc and Pocumtuck. A geographer by training, who received her Ph.D. in 1997 from Clarke. Her work over the past 30 years has focused on adaptation to climate change communication, science policy interactions, and psychosocial resilience in the face of traumatic and transformative challenges associated with climate change. She has served on scientific advisory boards for Future Earth, the International Science Council, the U.S. National Research Council, and contributed to IPCC and U.S. National Climate Assessments. You can learn more about her at her website, www.susannemoser.com. And so with that, I would like to welcome our 4 panelists, and I would like to call up, give them a round of applause. And with gratitude for persisting towards the tail end of the many panels that have already come before us. So thank you, and I'd like to call up Professor Turner now. Okay.
could probably take one and stand. We could sit
I
down.
think that's working. No, I can see it. I'll just sit down. Since I don't have slides to show. You have to pay me if you want slides. Anyway. All right, this is working?
Yeah.
All right. So, I think it's appropriate for me to go first because I want to delve into a little history of human environment legacies at Clark University in the GSG as a backdrop to the ET, which this session is building off of. All right, so this is my interpretation, as Mona said. All right, it's my interpretation. Geography at large pinned a chorological identity as a spatial science / GI science during the latter half of the 20th century, maybe a little earlier. I suggest that Clark did not necessarily sync with that vision. In fact, I would more than suggest that. Despite the fact that the GSG hosted economic geography, the program in the 1970s had minimal practitioners of our graduate coursework addressing spatial and GI science. We had nothing akin to UC Santa Barbara, Ohio State, and the other programs that really did focus on those areas. Contrary to the chorological identity, that's what I call the spatial group, Clark had a strong human environmental one, linked back at least to the 1970s to Harlan Barrows and Gilbert White's interest in human adjustment to the occupied environment. That then giving rise to SynTech and ultimately the Marsh Institute. So at that time, that's not the only human environment geography that was present, but it was the one that really had cachet across the discipline and beyond. Now, what most people don't remember is that part of that early SynTech focus was on development. And it engaged human environment practitioners interested largely in development in the tropical world. Not necessarily in the critical tradition that permeated Clark at the time as well. But through time, right, that group was complemented or joined by many of those engaged in critical approaches, and that ultimately evolved to political ecology and ultimately, foremost, feminist political ecology as it was helped to be developed. Clark began to increase its chorological identity, its spatial GI science, with the emergence of Idrisi in 1987. However, I want to remind folks that the work, both the remote sensing work and the analytical employment of Idrisi through Clark Labs overwhelmingly focused on the environment and our human environment problems. So it complemented the larger human environment themes that permeated throughout the GSG. Now, I'm not suggesting that the Clark program did not have well-known, even luminary practitioners, and was known for and produced outstanding graduate students beyond the human environment realm. It did. We heard today at lunchtime. We could go to the other sessions and entertain that. But I would argue that as we entered the 21st century, more than one half of the faculty members engaged in various facets of the human environment problem in some different approaches and ways. And by my count, 3/4 of all the graduate students in the program were so engaged. By the 1990s, we had created the ET venture, and what perhaps is forgotten, the GSG was the headquarters of the emerging land use land cover change program, which is now the global land program of Future Earth. And hence, we were part of the community that gave rise to what is now called land system science. I'm going to be very short. the point I'm trying to make of all of this is that by the first decade of the new century, the Graduate School of Geography was a hotbed of human environmental sciences and studies. It stood distinctive to the other programs in geography focused on spatial science or other chorological lenses. Other schools did have various facets of human environment geography, but none had the complete array that Clark had. The others did not have the number of practitioners, did not have the number of graduates that filled the academic ranks, and did not have the number of on-site graduate students engaged in what I'm calling the larger human environment ranks. Not just human environment ranks in geography, but human environmental science in general. So let me re-emphasize those that were all present at the turn of the new century. They were, of course, risk hazards, political ecology, land system science, emergent sustainability, ADRISI as applied to human environment problems, and the department added, finally, strong physical geography. So it really made this place quite something for the array of studies that we can say is human environmental science. We were asked in this section to say a few comments about the future. I'm somewhat reluctant to do that. I really believe that you reach a certain age group, and that's me, in which you have to pass it on to the young folk. The junior, those much more junior than you, to say this is the realm of which we were going. But I will say two things about what that future may entertain. The first is linking the state of the art of understanding from research to real-world practice. That's what Jane Lachenko called the useful science, or science as being useful. Or it could be what Stokes said in his assessment of science. He labeled one of the quadrants of science Pasteur's quadrant. You know, one in which you're doing basic research, but that basic research is predicated on societal issues, or those that society deems important. Now, this is what CENTED, or the Marsh Institute, has always claimed to be practicing. And I must say, after listening to Tony Beppington's talk this morning, maybe it's time for the geographical sciences, or the Graduate School of Geography, to maybe start to entertain more strongly again than maybe it is at this time. I'm not here, so I can't speak with authority. The second thing I would argue is that human environment geography and spatial geography have never intertwined well. I'm thinking of my current colleagues that do incredible work with geographical weighted regressions, and I can see how that can be powerful in various problems that the human environmental people address, but they don't use it. Not many people that even understand it. So I'm suggesting that beyond the remote sensing elements, beyond what ADRISI has done today, an inclusion of the stronger elements of spatial science that could be useful to the human environment problems is something we should think about. And those are my thoughts. Thanks.
Lovely to see you all. Thank you so much for being here. I thought I would give a slightly different perspective from the other panelists in terms of thinking about the cryosphere and in thinking about marine environments. So for those of you that were at the GI Science ESS panel yesterday, I have a little bit of a similar setup, but don't worry, I'm going to swerve very quickly in a couple minutes. But I run the Polar Science Research Lab here on campus. If you look at the work that we've done since I've arrived on campus 16 years ago, my work kind of shakes out into 3 different nodes with my students. I do work looking at sea ice and Arctic marine ecosystems. I do work looking at the biogeochemical and hydrological impacts of permafrost degradation, and then also looking at glaciers, ice sheets, and snowmelt dynamics as it relates to climate change. We do work at both poles, in the Arctic and in the Antarctic, and with multiple different types of methodologies as well. I want to focus in particular on sea ice environments. And it's probably no surprise to you all, we've seen some massive declines in sea ice since we've been measuring them with remote sensing since the late 1970s. You can see we've had some really interesting outliers over the past several years or so. If you look at sort of long-term trends per year, we've lost almost 80,000 square kilometers of sea ice, which equates to about the size of all of South Carolina per year. So if you sort of just have a spatial recognition of what this looks like from sort of the late 1970s, 1980, and what, for instance, what 2012 looked like in terms of sea ice extent, there's been really remarkable, pretty transformative change on the planet. Future predictions show that perhaps during seasonal sea ice minimum, which is September, as you see here, it's thought that perhaps by the year 2040, we may have no summer sea ice in the Arctic whatsoever. So thinking about the removal of sort of a really integral part of our climate system, really in effect being erased off of a map, have really profound changes. Sea ice is incredibly variable in terms of what it looks like, in terms of its thickness, in terms of its snow cover, in terms of its seasonality. You can get a sense of some field work that we've done with sea ice during March, with seasonal sea ice maximum in the Bering Sea. You can see right before we have seasonal sea ice breakup, the melt ponding that exists across these areas can be really remarkable, as you see on the right there. In terms of a lot of the work that we've done with boots on the ground, or boots on the ice, I suppose, we've really tried to understand what the impacts of this sea ice decline actually are. If I stuck you all sort of on my optical instruments and sent you through about a 1.5 meter thickness of sea ice, and brought you through the water column underneath this sea ice. In this case, this is actually the Chukchi Sea, which is north of Bering Strait, sort of northwest of Alaska. As you sort of look at the underside of the sea ice, as you kind of make your way down, I'm standing in the middle of a melt pond. And if you look at those melt ponds from the top right-hand photograph there, the melt ponds are very dark. And they're very dark, which means that they have very low albedo. So you have an incredible amount of absorption of light, and that light gets transmitted through the sea ice in really remarkable ways. These melt ponds effectively act as skylights, and they can transmit up to 70% of the light that gets to the top of the sea ice in the first place. And so thinking about the amount of changes that we're seeing through changes in the sea ice surface and how that transmits its way through, literally through the sea ice, and how that impacts the water column below can have really remarkable impacts on ocean heating, on the photodegradation of organic material, and on primary productivity as well, which is the base of the entire food web that we see across these really important marine ecosystems. So it's really the photographic negative that you see. You're about 20 meters below the sea ice here, but you're effectively seeing these skylines. So swerving a little bit, I'm sure you've sort of seen these types of graphics before, and certainly heard them talked about quite a bit over the last couple of days. There's lots of different ways geography programs and research can partition itself. This is sort of how the Graduate School of Geography has partitioned itself over the most recent past, thinking about Earth system science, urban economic geography, human environment geography, GI science, geospatial analytics, and remote sensing. But I want to argue sort of for a moment that geography is really kind of a quintessential discipline to address the incredibly interdisciplinary impacts that declining sea ice promotes across the Arctic. And thinking sort of for a moment, I want to sort of argue, and for those of you that might be looking for dissertation topics in the future, I just sort of wanted to lay out some ideas of things that we're thinking about and things that I think are really worthwhile to think about in the future in terms of how these interdisciplinary aspects of sea ice is really well suited for studying within the discipline of geography that attacks all of these different facets of the world and enables us to study the world as it is, with no boundaries, with no silos, and really thinking about how all of these cascading impacts kind of percolate through these different aspects of things. So you see on the left a Landsat satellite image of the Bering Straits. We use the ocean color to tell us something about how much chlorophyll there is in the water. We can then use that to model how much primary productivity and how much carbon we're actually generating through photosynthesis. Half of all global photosynthesis occurs in the world's oceans. So terrestrial ecosystems are incredibly important, but in terms of thinking about how carbon is transported across the planet, we also can't forget about the oceans as well. So we spend an awful lot of time sort of collecting these waters, getting a sense of how much chlorophyll there is in there. But we also are starting to think a little bit about what the sort of species makeup is of these phytoplankton as well. My current PhD student, Anna Zuz, you see sort of modeling for scale up there, standing with an instrument called an imaging flow cytobot, an IFCB. It was actually originally developed to image white and red blood cells in human health studies. But the marine scientists have adapted this to image individual cells of phytoplankton and use sort of AI morphology techniques to automatically identify species of phytoplankton. And what we're starting to notice is we see really sort of emergent issues with harmful algal blooms in the Arctic that haven't existed before. And we're seeing these things because the waters are warming, the waters are getting more light through melt ponding, and it's becoming sort of environment that is hospitable to harmful algal blooms. So you can see, for instance, Photonetia and B there, we see Alexandrium and G there, but these are really important species that can produce things like saxitoxins and domoic acid that cause paralytic and amnesic shellfish poisoning. So really important in terms of how that works its way off the food web. You can see the map on the bottom right there that shows the upper trophic mammals that have now seen harmful algal toxins in their systems. How we can sort of do this with field monitoring, how we can look at this with biodiversity mapping through geospatial analytics, how this impacts indigenous communities, how this impacts fisheries is incredibly interdisciplinary questions that we really need to address with this emerging issue across the Arctic. I don't know whether you followed the news with this or not, but for the very first time in October 2022, Alaska canceled its Bering Sea snow crab harvest, which is a $132 million per year industry. One of our field sites down here normally experiences about 150 days per year of sea ice cover. In 2018, it experienced 17 days of sea ice cover. So a huge collapse in terms of the amount of sea ice cover that this area experiences. You probably all know that sea ice forms from the freezing process of ocean water. What you might not know is that sea ice itself is actually quite fresh. I could, cut up some sea ice for you and stick it in your drink, and you would drink it and it wouldn't taste salty at all. And the reason for this is because as ocean water freezes, you get brine rejection, and that very cold, salty water that gets rejected is very dense and it's very heavy and it sinks to the bottom of the seafloor very, very quickly and very readily. And that cold water at the bottom of the seafloor is a really important habitat for snow crabs. So there was a 90% decline in the snow crab populations from 2018 to 2021. So 3 years, we lost 90% of the snow crab population. And so thinking about how sea ice impacts this, how can we sort of monitor the cold pool that forms from sea ice formation? How can we use remote sensing? How can we sort of see how this is going to impact indigenous communities and fisheries as well is a really critical issue as well. Thirdly, thinking about sea ice decline is a question of access. Access. When you decline sea ice, you increase access. And so what you're seeing on the left is a map of the number of unique ship visits over basically the last decade or so. You're seeing a time series there as well. Arctic-wide shipping activity has roughly doubled over the past decade or so, not only during the summer, but also during the winter. Arctic ship traffic obviously has a huge amount of risks in terms of oil and chemical spills, trash, interference with systems hunting, noise pollution, air pollution with black carbon, overfishing, ship strikes with marine mammals, introduction of invasive species from ballast. So thinking about geospatial analysis, subsistence hunting, how this sort of has global economic impacts is going to be critical. What you may or may not have also seen in the news over the past several weeks, very quite new news, Alaska's Keelak LNG company targeted Asia with a $5 billion project to compete with Russia for shipping from Alaska's North Slope huge amounts of LNG to basically fill the void from the embargoes of Moscow LNG from Yamal. Keelak is 2,000 nautical miles closer to Asian markets than what they were previously getting from Yamal in Russia, and so thinking about how this is going to impact these Arctic waters with this massive projected increase in shipping in these areas is really, really critical to monitor for lots of different reasons. The last thing I just wanted to mention, I don't know whether you've seen this picture before, but it's quite a famous one. It's actually from a town called Shishmaref, which is on a barrier island community of about 600 residents, indigenous residents, on the Chukchi Sea. In 2016, they voted to relocate, because of climate change issues and coastal erosion, their community inland. And the reason for that is because with the loss of sea ice, we have a huge amount of coastal erosion that's increasing very dramatically. So when you have the loss of sea ice, concurrently when you have permafrost degradation, the risk of these coastal communities to coastal erosion is really increasing dramatically. You can actually get a sense of the types of erosion that we're seeing across coastal indigenous locations as well. You can see, for instance, Newtok and Nakakiak. Newtok, for instance, 72.8 feet in a single year of coastal erosion. And you may have also, for instance, seen this in the news as well in the very recent past, that there's a huge amount of money that is needing to be dedicated to thinking about how all of these coastal communities can be potentially relocated. So thinking about where is the sea ice declining, where do we have vulnerable coasts, what are we thinking about in terms of climate responsibility and the reparations of climate as well. The Department of Interior has determined that we probably over the next 50 years need $3.45 billion to basically deal and be attentive to the need for Native Alaskan villages to deal with infrastructure and relocation efforts. So with that, I just want to say a very, very special thank you to all of the fantastic students at Clark that I've had a chance to work with. And I'm really indebted to you. It's one of the most fabulous parts of my job. So it's nice to see many of you here today. So thank you.
So my expertise, I'm Dr. Chris Williams here at Clark Geography's Graduate School of Geography. My expertise is in global ecology, earth system science, and climate. And lately my research is focused on assessing the use of forests as a climate solution and trying to document when and where we can achieve the greatest climate mitigation benefits from protecting and expanding forest cover. I'm showing this slide just as an example of a talk I gave fairly recently. But I'm not going to talk about this today. I'd love to talk about this with you at some point. That's not what I think I might have been asked to talk about. I think I'm here instead to join the session to offer some reflections about Earth Transformed as a watershed moment for Clark Geography and to reflect on what it means for us today and perhaps what it means for how we conduct ourselves as scholars, as educators in the current moment. So as a bit of a preamble, the first thing I want to tell you is I'll admit I was not part of the Earth Transformed. I joined Clark in 2008, just after Dr. Frey, about 2 decades after the ET event, the Earth Transformed event. So anything I say about the motivations or the context or the currents of the time are mostly speculation, and I'm hoping that those who were here will correct me, and I'm looking at you, Billie, I'm sure you will. And I welcome that. Secondly, on a more personal note, when I was preparing my remarks today, it brought me back. It brought me back to the time when I was an undergraduate student at Bucknell University. I took part in a residential environmental college. It was adjacent to a social justice college as well, and some others. It was filled with students who were concerned about the environment, about social justice, about the problems of our time. Students who were aware and who were critical. We were agitated. We might have been a bit rebellious. We were struggling to figure out who we are, what we stand for, and how we can affect positive change. Though none of us knew it at the time, it turns out that a lot of us ended up as geographers. We were geographers, we just didn't know it yet. Brian King, currently the chair of the Department of Geography at Penn State University. Jackie Vajunik, a Clark Geography Ph.D. who's been with us this week, class of 2007. Also a professor of geography, but at Oklahoma State University. Joel Wainwright, professor of geography at The Ohio State University. And there were others. We challenged each other, we learned from each other, and we also learned a lot from our outstanding faculty, but I feel like I learned most from my cohort then of undergraduate students. This was in the early 1990s, just after Earth Transformed, published in 1990. Just after that event had taken place, and some of the volumes that I returned to understand the context of Earth Transformed, when it was happening, I was reading when I was an undergraduate, and it was fun to return to those and to think about how we've arrived to the current moment from that foundation. So that's the second preamble thought. The third is that a lot of what I have today is really questions more than answers. They're thoughts that are meant to open or continue a dialogue about how we should conduct ourselves, again, as scholars and educators to meet this moment in time. So that was rather lengthy, and now I'm going to continue on with my conjectures about Earth Transformed and what it means to where we are now. So I think Earth Transformed was born out of alarm, out of concern, a time when scholars recognized a need to make visible what has been called as our, quote, take on the world, or said another way, the significant and accumulating impacts of humankind on the planet. The purpose of ET has been stated as follows, quote, to document the changes in the biosphere that have taken place over the last 300 years, or 320 years as it may now be, 330, to contrast global patterns of change to those appearing on regional levels, and to explain the major human forces that have driven these changes, highlighting document and explain. So looking back from now, you could see it as a kind of an early warning about continuing on the path that we're on. I think you may have noticed, I certainly have, I'm sure we all have noticed, that we definitely are well past early warning at this time. What was then recognized as significant and accumulating impacts are now being observed as in many ways obscene and grotesque. Also at that time, Earth Transformed, we were all aware of the limits to growth. We had heard a call for sustainable development as an agenda, a global agenda with the Brundtland Report, Our Common Future. That was path-breaking work that I had read about at the time. And it opens with a call to action for divisive political action to manage environmental resources to ensure both sustainable human progress and human survival. To build a future that's more prosperous, more just, and more secure. We had seen the planet from space at that time, such as shown in this image from Apollo 8. It opened our minds to seeing the Earth as a small and fragile ball, quote, dominated not by human activity and edifice, but by a pattern of clouds, oceans, greenery, and soils. Even a scientist had, at the time of this photo, already imagined Earth as a kind of a pseudo-organism whose health depends on its many systems and cycles working in harmony. Now it was much more visible to humankind and laid plain to see. But what we could not see in that image, and we still wouldn't really see today, are the ways in which the planet is being dominated by human action. It's not immediately evident in this kind of image. So we see Earth as an organism, but maybe not all of the impacts we're having. Some of them, admittedly, invisible to this kind of image. Since that time, a lot has changed. We've developed new concepts. I'll run through a few. We are well beyond Brundtland. Anyone familiar with the Ph.D. book that I also had read at the time? We have now much improved understandings of sustainable development that better engages issues of equity and justice and avoids overestimation of techno-solutions and the value of economic progress and growth. We now recognize the current era as a new geologic era, right? We call it the Anthropocene, an geologic epoch marked by mass extinctions caused by human activity at humans' hands. We've documented what was called in ET the Great Transformation, but now we might even think about it as the Great Acceleration, an acceleration of human impacts, consumption, waste, pollution, strife, and more. Scientists have identified tipping points in the Earth system beyond which there may be no return, and this notion of irreversibility for our planetary system. We recognize that our pathways in the future may be irreversible, locking Earth into an altered and diminished state, less suitable for habitability, and we're on the lookout. We're able to observe elements of this. And along the way, we've gotten a lot better at documenting and at explaining the change. We use Earth observation satellites, ground-based networks, and communities of practice. So things have changed. Additional new concepts. We now talk about threats to planetary life support as a system, the boundaries for a safe operating space for humanity, with a wide range of processes that can endanger planetary health. And in many ways, the story of Earth Transformed holds true today, with planetary harm not only accumulating, but sadly still accelerating. We now have a much more mature classification of the areas of work for sustainable development. They're talked about not just as perils, but as goals. And we also talk about pathways to addressing these challenges. So much has changed. But in other ways, we're still in very much the same place. Here's a short list of what I think we can say we've accomplished. We've raised awareness, we've documented change, we've gotten very good at explaining drivers, and we've identified and understand many of the consequences of these changes. But I would say that there may be room for very significant additional advance. So here are some of the things that I think that we can grow and improve. We need to speak to policy. We need to become more aware of the context of our work. We can grow to improve in this way. Also, we heard yesterday from Riku that we are now starting to take normative positions about the work that we do. We're thinking about how we can counter myths, and we're framing our work more towards solutions. So this begs a question, really. What is required of us now? What is it that we need to do differently as educators, as scholars? One of the things I think about is that we may need to change voice at times, change voice from passive to active, and many of us are now doing this. This is a new direction. For example, we can document human-environment interactions. We can maybe shift that to discussing human-Earth relationships, or take it further to think about designing planetary stewardship. In many ways, those are talking about the same thing, but in a different way. We can even talk about guiding policy and management that sustains the planetary life support system. So from human-environment interactions to sustenance and maintenance and management of a planetary life support system. From another lens, this strikes me as shifting from Earth as transformed by human action to Earth as sustained by human action. I think we've noticed that we're definitely far away from where we need to be, but these are some ideas of how we can make significant progress to get where we need to go. The second thing I think is required of us is to lock in on the additional purpose that we have as scholars and educators. Today's challenges call on universities to do something different, to revisit our organization, to think about how we're put together, what we work on, and maybe even revisit some of our priorities. It asks questions about the pillars of higher education. Witnessing the change in complexity and strife in the world in the mid-1990s, Jacques Delors led a UNESCO commission that suggested 4 pillars upon which education could rest. To, quote, simultaneously provide maps of a world in constant turmoil and a compass that will enable people to find their way in it. That sentiment seems apt today. Others have identified service and advocacy as major pillars of the university, alongside scholarship and practice. These are also key elements, for example, in the Boucher Graduate Honor Society, something that I admire. This additional purpose asks us to further engage with the wider world as a force for social good. The third thing that I think we could say is required of us is to extend to praxis, increasingly. And this one, I'll admit, can be tricky, and I want to talk a little bit about some of the things that make that difficult. It calls on us to go from asking questions that cultivate thinking to asking questions that cultivate action. There are tensions in doing this, in making this kind of shift. One is that it can preference applied work over basic research. And as we were also hearing yesterday, geography and many other disciplines are strongest when connected and grounded in science. I wouldn't argue for a loss of that basic research. There's also a risk of overemphasizing practice at the expense of theory. And furthermore, as educators and scholars, we definitely need to preserve the integrity of our craft by avoiding preaching our values, our thoughts, our own vision of things, and our judgments. Finding the right balance among these is really challenging. It's very difficult, and it becomes increasingly so as we extend towards praxis, I would say. So I don't have the answers, but this is more a question and hopefully a conversation about how we pivot from where we are now to meet this really critical moment in Earth's future. I think Clark Geography and its peer unit, the Department of International Development Community Environment, are uniquely well positioned to navigate these directions and to act as leaders. In fact, we've heard all about it in the past couple of days, and we'll continue to into this afternoon. It's evident in every single session in the Centennial. It really jumps out. So I now want to just say, why geography? Why did Earth Transformed happen in geography? Why is this conference happening in geography? Why is this current or stream and direction for universities something that comes out of geography? The first argument I would say is that we're system thinkers, we're integrators. In one view, E.T. was published in Nature. In a review of E.T. published in Nature, it was described as, quote, an impressive and highly laudable undertaking by geographers to, quote, put it all together. That is, to establish a theoretical framework for assessing the environmental changes wrought by modern societies in the past 3 centuries, and to document these changes in detail. We are system thinkers. We're integrators. How do we put it all together today? The second, this is from Jackie Bajunik. I don't know if you saw this yesterday, but geography as bricolage. The construction or creation from a diverse range of available things. We as geographers see things holistically, maybe more holistically than many. We make sure things are not forgotten. We make use of what's available. We draw from other disciplines, from diverse methods, from adjacent fields. We pull it together to do magic. The third is that we're free to be critical. In geography, we're free to be critical not just as critical thinkers, of course we all are, but also critical voices, and maybe even critical actors. This helps us uncover the manifold dimensions of today's wicked problems and to see the many realities of the present conditions. Fourth, geographers are, of course, great at thinking about scale. And not just thinking about scale, but thinking at scale, something that's really critical for the challenges we face today, certainly for climate change. We think about how things add up. We think about what's scalable. And then fifth, we're conveners. As geographers, we do convene, and Earth Transformed is probably one of the best examples I can imagine of that. So the last thing I'll say is just that we have an opportunity, I think, to make a real change, a real difference as geographers, and through the Graduate School of Geography at this time, that change is needed. But we need to have, I think, some new conversations. Returning to this question of what's required, to have the voice and the impact this time demands, for me, it's mostly about having new conversations, having the right conversations with the right people. If we want to get beyond documenting and explaining, which we must, if we want to deliver on the additional purposes of universities, if we want to extend in praxis in productive ways, we need to be talking to new actors in society, including actors such as these. This is something that I found in my work to make all the difference. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And wow, do you all need to like stand up and take a breath or something? It's hard to keep going. But anyway, so I want to take us one step further from these great talks and sort of draw an arc, possibly, of going from Earth transformed by human action to human transformation to safeguard the Earth. And think about what might that mean in terms of our future research and practice. And I put this here in mind, in part because Billie in his introduction and others have done this. There were many good predecessors, if you will, to this, or not many, but two very significant predecessors to this volume. Obviously, George Perkins' Marx, Man and Nature, and then Thomas's Man's Role in Changing the Face of the Earth. And not having done such a global assessment for whatever, 30 years or something like that, 40 years, is part of what motivated the ET volume. And I put it here in a trajectory with some of the assessments we've already heard about, IPCC assessments and the IPBES assessments, in part because it actually strikes me as what that was an assessment. Where are we, right? It wasn't involved, didn't have a summary for policymakers, it didn't have that whole apparatus and constraint put on it, but I think it actually stands quite well in that kind of a history. I looked at it again. I haven't actually opened that volume in quite a while in preparation for this talk, and thought, wow, it struck me as, it's obviously global with lots of regional case studies, multidisciplinary, international, more than 80 people contributed to it. It was massive. Billie can attest to that. And certainly for not just Clark, but I think for the entire human dimensions community, it was a really critical milestone. And as we just heard, very much focused on documenting the drivers and the impacts of change. It was also striking to me, it was remarkable in a few other ways. It was still somewhat awestruck by how powerful we humans are, like in a positive sense. It struck me as, wow, probably today we couldn't write that kind of a volume again in that particular voice. Wildly optimistic still that we can actually rein all these impacts in, that we can mitigate what we're creating. I was awestruck by it when I read it as a graduate student. It had just been published when I came to Clark, and it was, wow, this is really powerful. But it was also remarkably apolitical, of course, with all the desire to be objective and all that stuff, but it just struck me as, where are the critical voices actually that so much of Clark is actually noted for, right? It was not coming through in that. And as we heard, it only began to unpack why we do what we do, and therefore what might we do to change that or to turn the ship around. I'm not going to belabor this. Now we have a different way of maybe a different nomenclature for talking about not the drivers, but the impacts that affect our world. It still feels to me in this nomenclature rather detached. But we also have now some of the more critical voices, and they sound more like a disaster made come true by our refusal to make the world a matter of care. Anybody guess who that is? An unprecedented looking away. A time when every fiber of our being is interlaced, even complicit in the webs of processes that must somehow be engaged and must be repatterned. This is Donna Haraway. Oops, sorry, let me go back here. An outrage meriting a name like the Anthropocene. And I don't know if you saw this recently, but in the process of actually establishing this as a geologic period, they're now looking for a site, a defining site on planet Earth that would represent the beginning of the Anthropocene. I challenge you all, as you go through the rest of your day, to think about where on Earth would you put that site? What would adequately represent the beginning of the Anthropocene? I think it's a fun question to think about. So I want to actually spend a little bit of time, what's happened since then. Of course, this push for having the Anthropocene recognized is taking shape. Many more critical voices. I just, put our favorite post everything's words here. But we also have, in the meantime, done a lot more work in considering how do we work at that science-society interface that you just talked about, in terms of how do we bring this to policymakers, how do we bring this to the population. We have a burgeoning science of adaptation. Of course, it was begun, right, in the tradition of cultural and political ecology. We have begun that science, but it's really taken off since then. The same is true for the science of sustainability, and we have an emergent science on transformation. How do we actually turn this ship around? How do we do that? What does that look like? Pathways to sustainability is one element of that, but there are other traditions, other perspectives informing. So I want to focus on this particular one because I've sort of been playing in my own career in those three areas, in particular in the last 10 years or so, 15 years in that context of transformations to sustainability, which is, to me, sort of almost a logical outgrowth of my own career out of what I first learned here at Clark. There's an international organization called, or used to be called, the International Science, well, now it's the International Science Council. It used to be ICSU and ISSC, the International Social Science Council, that began this series of thinking about what would it look like if we were to research how we can actually transform. So this is not just looking at how we have transformed the Earth, this is how could we transform so as to get to a sustainable planet and life. It developed in 2012 something called Transformative Cornerstones of Social Science Research. I think it could have been not just the social science, but the human environment geography research agenda, essentially. It very well captured what kinds of things we need to focus on. I got involved in 2013 with the World Social Science Report that took sort of a little bit of a survey of what is the social science happening right now on this topic. And we basically looked at it. It's still not really making a difference. It's still very much isolated case studies and not really pushing us forward in the way we needed to. Remember, this is all a couple years just before we had the Paris Agreement, a couple years before we had the Sustainability Development Goals, right? So this is all in the lead up. Do we have anything to say to these people, right? That's what this was. And then we basically decided, based on that we would really accelerate research on transformations. Belmont Forum and other funders since then, Swedish Development Agency, SIDA, and Norface and others have since then invested a considerable amount of research funding to try to understand how we accelerate transformations to sustainability, how we navigate it, can we do anything in that regard? And that's happened since. And I've been involved as a senior advisor to this Transformations to Sustainability program for the length of its existence since 2014. And one of the things in looking back over this entire time that struck me is how difficult it actually is to see transformation happening, right? It's complex, it's lengthy, happens often, if you will, in the deep, right? You don't necessarily see it, or the things that you can see are maybe not the most important one. It is trying to get at these underlying conditions, which it is why it's so hard to see. Happens over long periods of time, involves so many different people, and oftentimes it happens not just at multiple scales, but at the margins of society, the places we don't necessarily go looking. So that led me to think about, can we actually systematically describe what is the work that we as researchers engage in participating and in supporting these transformative processes. Before I go and tell you what I found, I want to sort of put before you something that came out of a paper that I wrote with my own graduate student, Lyndon, was about adaptation and to what extent we have transformative adaptation here in the United States. But one of the key things that we put forward is this little graphic here, which essentially says there are conditions, if you will, that need to be, or factors that need to be changed in order to get to transformative change. The kinds of things we most often focus on are policies, practices, who gets the money, that kind of thing, right? That's what we all observe. That's the, that's the most experienced, approximate source of unsustainability and injustice. And in some ways, you can trace that back to the kinds of things that were discussed in the ET volume. Underneath that, and the reason why we have these policies, you need to look at who sits at the table, who makes those decisions, right? And what are the power dynamics among those actors at the table? And then, of course, who gets to sit at the table has everything to do with what we value, who we value, what kinds of ways we want to engage with each other, or what beliefs we have about who should be at the table. So the second layer here is often the hidden cause, if you will, behind injustice and unsustainability, and this one here we barely ever talk about. It's certainly not the most critical aspect of geographic research, but maybe it should be if we're interested in transforming our society to something more sustainable. So if that's sort of our, if you will, a mental map of how we might affect transformative change, and now you come back to the question, how do we actually engage as researchers with that? Are we almost done? I developed this concept that's currently under review at Global Environmental Change of transformative labor. You all have heard the term emotional labor, right? The work often done by, very often by women in service positions who essentially have to put on a nice smiley face, right, in order to deliver their services. Transformative labor almost borrows from that and has many of the same intents, but it is in one particular way very different. And that is, with emotional labor, you actually try to keep your job and do not challenge the system in which you work, right? You do not change or challenge your wage labor. With transformative labor, you're actually trying to affect the systems at the deepest level that I just pointed out. So when I looked at all the projects that were funded through this transformations program, I sort of felt like they were doing some things over and over and over and over and over again. And I put them in these 7 categories. Some of it has to do with just naming what's wrong here. And as researchers, we have incredible power and privilege in helping and supporting local actors who may not be heard, right? Often the marginalized, often the oppressed, the displaced, whatever, to help name the conditions for them and lend our authority to that is a really important piece of work. Creating transformative spaces is essentially bringing people to the table and basically helping them vision what is it that you want, as opposed to us imposing something. Then fostering agency, empowerment through education, through trainings, through simply giving them the tools that oftentimes we do work on. Enacting steps to change conditions. Many times in these projects, the researchers got involved in actually helping people take those steps or to actually be part of that. So they did not distance themselves from the systems. Visioning, moving to desired outcomes, and all the work that is involved in that, and central to all of it is a constant caring, tending, learning attitude and work in helping that process to go on. The final one you see on the outside has everything to do with scaling. We have a lot to say about that, scaling up, scaling out, scaling deep, and maybe even making a connection to the talk earlier. That deeply involves engaging the political systems and political will. That work is risky, costly, transgressive. It is typically done by the marginalized, by the less, not by the ones in power. It is iterative, ongoing, nonlinear, can't predict it very well. It varies certainly in context and in intensity, but I have seen it happen again and again in the most diverse type of research projects that were funded. Maybe the last thing I want to say from this long list here is some of that work is actually first and foremost destructive. deconstructive. It is taking something apart. All transformation actually begins with an ending, not with a new. First you have to take something apart, right? Namely the system that is unjust and unsustainable. And then it gets to be creative and be constructive and healing. So I'll simply end with that to say, you know, where do we then go over the next 100 or 300 years? I think that the shift is going from ET to HT. What I mean by that is, what do we do to transform the drivers of a transforming Earth? What do we do to deal with the now inevitable transformative changes? And ultimately, how do we ourselves be transformed in the process? And that gets to the mindset shift. So in my humble opinion, the grand era of human environment studies is yet before us. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much to all of our speakers and panelists. We actually have about a little bit over 10 minutes for questions. Yes? Oh, you have a question? I'm going to actually first invite our panelists to come have a seat up here so they can turn around, they can talk directly to you without having to turn around awkwardly. So, if you don't mind. Okay.
Turn off the red light. Down here is
Yeah, I think.
Did we do that?
I think we have to ask. So they need that slide up. But, okay. Anyway, I will be roving around with the microphone here, and I have to go all the way to the back to get to Jim first.
Oh, should I go? Oh, I thought you were let the panelists talk. Sorry.
No, questions.
Oh, I was just whining for no reason. I'm so glad to get a chance to actually participate in something beyond assigning people to tables and making sure that people have clickers for their presentations. So one of the things that struck me for years about sustainability science, and I got this reaction, Billie, when we had the 25th here. I think it was the 25th when you were here and others were here. So I feel like there's a supply side bias to sustainability science that limits its actual uptake and implementation in reality. And what I mean by that is there's a lot of production of science, and that science gets produced for policymakers. And what is not really accounted for as effectively are users, are consumers, are actual people and what they do. So what I'm getting at here is it's the earth transformed by human action. But the human action part, I feel like, is undervalued, is under-conceptualized, is under-operationalized. I think there's very oversimplified models of agency, of why people do what they do in sustainability science. We're still operating, I think, under a lot of very rational choice, bounded rationality models. And I think what we're failing to get at are more of the kind of grounded, embedded, geographically sensitive practices and rationales why people actually behave the way they do that produces all of these problems in the planet. And how we can actually align interventions to meet those, understand those practices, but then in the same sense, transform them. And I think the way I'm thinking about this is, well, sustainable development, if you go back to Michael Redcliffe's work, right, needs, values, rights, right? And so if we're talking about sustainability being about needs, values, rights, first of all, we need to define what is sustainable development, both sustainable and development, and I feel like the development gets very short shrift in this science. So for me, needs, we need to think about universal rights, and we also need to account for historical and structurally determined inequalities that have emerged and that have created a vastly uneven array of what needs are. And then when we think about rights, and this goes to what Susi was talking about, we need to think, of course, more about power, about political economy. We need to think about, I would say, go back to Haggerstrandian constraints. What are the authority constraints? What are the coupling constraints? What are the capability constraints that are facing people that shape their actions, that actually shape how they actually interact with the environment in better or worse ways? And thinking about those power-laden relationships. Values, culture, right? But not culturally deterministic explanations, but culturally sensitive understandings that what is considered rational and what is considered actually practical is going to vary. So in this sense, just to put in a plug for some stuff I've been doing, I think there's a really great opportunity for a conversation with this community associated with technical transitions people. It's a systems kind of approach, which I think would be appealing, but it's really only happening in Europe. And the reason I got introduced to this was Rob, Helena, and Philip had Bernard Truffer come here in 2010, and since that, it was like at the end of Casablanca. We've had a beautiful relationship since that time. Bernard and I, we've been doing a lot of work on this, and there's a whole community of geography and sustainability transitions that's emerged. I know, Lyndon.
Any of our panelists care to respond?
I have a question back to you, which is, you said we.
Oh, yeah.
Who is the we? Because in the places where I work, that's what's happening.
The we for me is, there is actually a Sustainable Transitions Network. It was actually David Angel who got me connected into that group when I first started here. So there is a whole, that's what I mean by that we. That we is a very diverse we. They're doing a lot of different kinds of things. So that's what I mean by that. And again, I'm just saying, I guess the point is the agency question. And I think, Susie, what you talked about resonated the most with what I'm thinking about, by far.
All right.
I would say that was a commentary with 3,000 questions embedded in it. And I could pick any one of those questions and have a response, but that would take forever. But I'll just note one, Jim, that if you look at the very first definition of what sustainability science is, it says all sustainable science must be place-based. Place-based precisely to grapple with all the nuances that you are articulating. So I don't think that, or let's say it's inappropriate to think that sustainability science only does some sort of global homogenization, right? It's just as Eleanor Ostrom said, right? There's no panacea. Everything must be, right, regarded into the cultural, the values. The critical issue is an interesting one, and it's one that I would argue is there today, much more than it was in the past. And that's often embedded in the academics, meaning that we're trying to get the entire academic community involved, research community involved. Well, that means you've got classical, neoclassical economics. And you just can't, if you're trying to engage them all, you can't, say we're going to favor one group or one way of framing a problem over others. And I agree that resource economists have played a very strong role in grappling what we see in sustainability science today. But I will end with one thing. I spent years and years and years trying to get international agreements over research designs. You go to the ecological community, and in 1 week they'll come back with you with a plan of action, tell you exactly what data they need, maybe the new tools that they have to get. You do the same thing with the social sciences, and it did this over and over and over again. And after a week, they would come back and say, we all agree to disagree.
Do you have any questions back here?
Well, thank you for coming. You guys have talked a lot about sustainable development and in regards to climate change, and all of you being very concerned about that. Something in environmental science that I've learned at Clark is a lot of professors talk about the energy sector, and I know you guys have talked about the admissions area. What would you recommend would be I suppose, like sustainable solution and development, let's say, in America, since we rely on greenhouse gases in regards to transition to something else, as there are many concerns about mining of it, the ethics of it, where the mining is done, how it will be funded, and what countries will be involved in the process.
I'll start off and then pass it. I'm not sure there is a sustainable pathway for getting to a clean energy revolution that addresses all of the deep decarbonization that's required in our energy systems. I do think that by using the technologies that are at hand and deploying them at large scale, we address a problem that has to be addressed, that has global significance, which of course is climate change. There are many dimensions to sustainability, and it's not just environmental impact or climate impacts directly, but there are economic and social dimensions of sustainability, as you well know. And when I think about the transformation to a clean energy future, let's say, I am not sure whether we'll go through, if we'll achieve a sustainability, if that achieving that green energy future, clean energy future, will necessarily, or even could and should, given the requirement of going fast, achieve social and economic justice and equity that's also required. I think there are pathways to the future of decarbonizing society that have an opportunity to lift humanity in these more significant ways, and also avoiding the harm to the planet through climate change. But I think it would be very slow. So I'm worried that it wouldn't happen fast enough. So insofar as your question is also about, and I heard it in the final part, about mining and the scars and the livelihoods that are affected by extraction and who gets to do that, elements that are about the political economy and the global, the human dimensions also of sustainability. I'm not sure that rapid deployment of green energy technologies will address any of that, even if we did it fast enough and it solved the climate change problem.
So thanks to the panelists. I'll throw out a couple of comments/questions, I guess, and people can respond as they like. I mean, in response to Billie's frustration with social science, which I understand, there's a lot of constant reinvention of terminology, and you see often, it seems, the same debates coming up with, essentially the same questions and dynamics, but different terminology decades later, and that can be frustrating. At the same time, I do think there's an important distinction, in that people understand themselves and act and organize themselves based in large part on how social sciences describe them and explain themselves to them in a way that I think is not true of the carbon cycle or sea ice. If we talk about sea ice differently, it doesn't necessarily change how sea ice behaves. If we tell people this is how human beings behave and ought to behave and how they operate, it actually changes how they operate in some ways. So there's a relationship there that it makes it complicated to have, stable, fixed, agreed upon definitions and procedures. I guess the broader question that I would put to the panel is one thing that so I appreciate the panel, I completely agree, this is absolutely what we as geographers, as universities ought to be prioritizing because of the urgency and magnitude of the problems. Thinking about a couple of, Susi, your last slides, and thinking about this question of fundamental drivers, I'm always frustrated to essentially not see capitalism up there as part of the conversation. I was actually having a conversation with Bonnie yesterday about, whether there are still Marxist perspectives in geography. One of the things that always strikes me so powerfully when I see, a lot of the graphs that get associated with the Anthropocene, and I'm sure that I imagine probably everyone in the room can picture or almost everyone can picture the graphs from the Stefan et al. Articles about the Anthropocene and, the rise in carbon emissions, the rise in primary energy use, the rise in population, the rise in fertilizer use, the, increase in deforestation, etc. It's kind of remarkable when you look at those graphs, they all correlate pretty closely with the Industrial Revolution and the increase in the global economy since then. And so I think we need to think more fundamentally about that as a fundamental driver. And then the last thing I'll say, and this goes to most directly maybe to Susi, to one of your points, but I think it also overlaps particularly with maybe some things that Chris brought up. I think you had a model of social change that began, or that had consciousness as the most fundamental level. So there's what's going on in the material world, and then there are institutions underneath that, and then there's sort of individual consciousness and values underneath that. And I think that I would advocate thinking of it in a more iterative and co-evolutionary way in which people's consciousnesses are not, they're born of their material circumstances. Our consciousnesses aren't separate from the way we get energy, the residential geographies we inhabit, how we get our food, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think that suggests that maybe one of those levels of change is not more fundamental than the other, but that perhaps the change has to begin with some of the material relationships, which maybe circles back to the question about energy transition. So I know that's a lot to put on the table, but those are my reflections.
I shall
It's
try.
a lot and we're out of time, but please try.
I'll try to do the Billie Turner
accommodate.
move and just pick one. So, yes, in that triangular graphic that I had, it was a very apolitical statement, if you will. It just looked at worldviews and sets of perspectives and values we hold and relationships, and then how that affects our actions. The arrows, however, between them go both ways. I could show you that when I go back. Anyway, the point of that is, depending on who you speak to, you can use this as a boundary object. In other words, something that you can start conversations around. But the actual analysis of what people see as the ultimate reason or the ultimate set of ways of thinking, like why did we get capitalism, right? Or what are some of the features of that particular system that make it as damaging, if you will, to human and the natural environment, right? But if I talk to a whole bunch of people, I don't know, who hold maybe that racism or colonialism is the deepest thing, right? Then the conversation stops if I put that on the table, right? You cannot bring people into the conversation or only a selected set of people into the conversation if you name one ism as the ultimate reason. So I think this is a great way to start the conversation so that we can together explore what is it that we each believe, and then how do we reconcile when we don't all agree on that, and how do we bring all of those perspectives together, because that's what we're going to struggle over, right? So I think it serves to at least start the conversation. I would not disagree with you how damaging that has been, but there's many people who study the beginning of the Anthropocene and would put that 5,000 years back, 10,000 years back, and the disconnect from nature, blah, blah, blah. So there are many roots to this problem.
Just a quickie. First of all, I agree with her, isn't it? I've gone through this, which isn't. I have a book, brand new book, The Anthropocene, 101 questions and answers for the human impact on the global environment. We talk about capitalism as a fundamental core. So it's not totally missing. And some of our actions,
So I have do people have forbearance for one more minute? There was one more question at the back.
Yes, good day. So I wanted to basically bring the point of, a few points. I wanted to talk about climate change denial for a second. What do you guys think about people that don't understand the concept of climate change or don't agree with it? And also, when I was studying geography at the university level, we looked at the impacts of climate change on small farmers and how are those people going to be incorporated into this whole talk of climate change, like in terms of like their farming practices and what they have done to kind of use their knowledge to kind of fight climate change or kind of adapt to it, So I just wanted to bring out those points.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's many reasons, and sort of innate to sort of the human psychology in terms of thinking about climate denialism. I mean, we're thinking, at least, maybe not now, but certainly over the recent past, I mean, climate change is this thing that we think about that's distant time horizons in faraway places. I guess as somebody who studies the polar regions and who is sort of there with boots on the ground, those sort of faraway places are sort of closer, I suppose, with my experience. But I think that's coming sort of closer. I do think that proximity is a huge issue in terms of understanding sort of the realities of climate change. And I do think those proximities are ever coming closer, you know, the realism of climate change is coming closer and closer. So there's all sorts of different ways to sort of think about climate change communication in terms of bringing those realities to bear, whether it's through the humanities, whether it's through art, whether it's through music, whether it's through storytelling, whether it's through the science message, whether it's through all sorts of different ways that we speak about climate change. And they're all really important. I mean, I think the current statistic that I just saw at Yale is there's something like 72% of Americans sort of believe that climate change is happening. But that, of course, goes down somewhat when you ask whether it's anthropogenically caused. But it's still more than 50%. So, and I think that those statistics are constantly improving. And so it'll be interesting to kind of see what that trajectory is over time and when those social tipping points may come to bear. Because I do think that perhaps those changes will come with the notion of proximity to climate change, and that always seems to be more so as more and more of us experience climate change firsthand.
All right, well, with that, sorry, was there another one?
I'll just add, it depends a little bit on who those people are. I think your question is really unanswerable in the abstract in which you asked it. Is it a... I mean, it really depends on, are people in denial because they don't like the causes, they don't like the solutions? Are they in denial because they don't see it? Are they in denial for political reasons? In my experience, it takes a lot of skill in being in dialogue with someone who doesn't agree with you. And this is the prime site of that example. When you wed that with, who is in power and how did they use it, in most instances, people are not in denial about this issue. They might say that they don't believe it, but that's not what they really have going on. And I think it's a matter of being in dialogue to find out where is that common ground we can find, or at least understand or still see each other as humans, as opposed to demons.
All right, well, thanks very much to our panel again. Thank you all.